I'm Claire Madison, 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the disappointment of the Madison family. People don't say it softly either. It's carved into every glance, every silence. My father Robert is the decorated one, the name etched in medals and service. My uncle Charles, the successful one, flaunts his empire in every room. Even my cousin Ethan was paraded as the golden heir. And me? I was the shadow measured not by what I did, but by what I failed to be. But the night I walked out of the academy wasn't the end of my story. It was the night they marked me as a failure, and the night I began to see how far my own family would go to erase me. Ever been told to stay in your place? To keep quiet while others steal the life you built? Hit like if someone ever took credit for your work. Comment if you've ever been the invisible one. Because for me, it all began with a door opening and a suitcase dropped on the polished floor of my father's house. Even now, after years away, the air here still carries judgment. The rugs, the photographs of Robert Madison in uniform, the polished frames lined with medals, all of it weighed on me, pressing me into the role of an unworthy daughter. I tried to hold myself straight, but the memory of walking out of the military academy years ago curled my spine. The image of my father's face, stone hard, when I announced I couldn't go on, has never left me. It shadows me tonight as I set my suitcase down in the hallway. Relatives gathered in the living room, voices mixing with the clinking of glasses and the scent of roast beef. Their eyes cut toward me the moment I appeared, and though their smiles curved politely, the disdain underneath was impossible to miss. A cousin leaned into another, murmuring something, and a ripple of quiet laughter followed. My chest tightened, but I forced a neutral expression. After all, I had known this reception awaited me. My father stood near the mantel, his frame as upright as ever, his white hair combed back with military precision. He held a tumbler of whiskey, but hadn't touched it. His gaze slid over me briefly, then shifted back to the crackling fireplace. No greeting, no inquiry about the years I'd spent away, no warmth. That absence of acknowledgement pierced more deeply than an insult ever could. I moved toward him, hoping at least for a few words. "Dad," I began softly. He gave the smallest of nods, then sipped the drink, eyes elsewhere. The knot in my throat hardened. Charles Walker, my uncle, strode in then, his presence filling the space like smoke. His suit gleamed, his tie perfectly knotted, and his smirk arrived before his words. "Claire," he said, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Back from your grand adventures of— what exactly? Couldn't even endure 2 years in uniform, am I right?" The laughter this time wasn't muffled. It spread openly, shoulders shaking, wine glasses clinking together in cruel amusement. I felt their eyes devouring me, confirming every whispered judgment, every cruel headline etched across my own heart. I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. My father's lips tightened, but he said nothing. He did not rebuke Charles, did not defend me. His silence filled the room heavier than all the ridicule combined. I looked down, my vision blurring against the polished floorboards. The mockery stung, but my father's quiet surrender cut far deeper, as though he agreed with them, as though I truly was the failure they believed me to be. Claire lowered her head, noticing her father's silence more painful than the mockery. Every toast felt like a dagger, every whisper sharper than a blade. The ballroom lobby shimmered with golden light from chandeliers, polished marble floors reflecting the steady movement of polished shoes and flowing gowns. I had stood in grand rooms before, but never had I felt so exposed, like every whisper carried my name, every glance labeled me an imposter in my father's world. Champagne glasses chimed as relatives and old colleagues congratulated each other on Robert Madison's long career. Yet whenever the topic turned toward me, their tones shifted to hushed amusement, like I was an anecdote, not a person. I lingered by a table laden with hors d'oeuvres, trying to be invisible. Behind me, 2 aunts spoke in voices just low enough to pretend they were discreet. "Poor girl," one said. "No career, no marriage, nothing to show." The other gave a pitying laugh. "Robert must carry that shame every day." My knuckles tightened around the stem of my glass. The words weren't knives, they were scalpels, slicing with precision at wounds already open. Charles arrived in full stride, as though the hotel itself had been built to frame him. His booming voice filled the air, drawing a circle of attentive listeners. He relished attention, each word coated with triumph. I edged closer, not out of curiosity, but because I recognized the cadence of his bragging. It was the same tone he had used years ago when he held Ethan up as the bright future of the family while mocking me for stumbling. Of course, Charles was saying, raising his glass. Our firm has just secured the cybersecurity contract from DHS. A monumental deal, a turning point not just for the company, but for the whole industry. It proves what real Madison blood can achieve. His smile cut across the room, pausing deliberately when his eyes landed on me, letting everyone catch the implication. The contract. My breath caught. I knew the project knew it more intimately than he ever would. It was the very operation where I had buried myself in code, tracing the digital claws of an attack that could have shut down an entire grid. Nights of exhaustion, endless screens of data, the silent terror of knowing one mistake would leave cities dark. Yet in the end, the official recognition had gone elsewhere. My role had been erased under the stamp of secrecy. Charles leaned closer to a small cluster of men in tailored suits. "This win," he said, "cements our reputation. The department knows who to trust when lives are at stake." They chuckled, eager to bask in the glow of his performance. I clenched my jaw. It wasn't trust they rewarded, it was theft. Ethan stood at his father's side, stiff and uneasy. His hands fidgeted with his cufflinks, his eyes darting toward me before slipping away. There was something in his expression, something fragile, like guilt pressing down on him. I remembered years ago, when Charles paraded him as the star student, contrasting him against my failure. The memory seared hot against my skin now, watching Ethan swallow words he clearly wanted to speak. The circle laughed at another one of Charles's boasts. I barely heard it. All I could feel was the revelation sinking in. I wasn't just denied pride within my family. Even the work I had bled for had been swept away, repackaged, and handed to Charles's firm as his legacy. He was stealing not only my dignity, but the proof of my worth. My chest tightened, breath shallow, the room spinning with glitter and malice. They would all remember this night as his victory, while I stood in the shadows, branded a disappointment. Rage and despair coiled in me, indistinguishable from one another. Then, through the laughter, a voice slid in calm, sharp, female. "Funny, Charles, isn't it? Taking credit for something you didn't do." In a sea of hostile eyes, hers was the only one that didn't judge me. The crowd's laughter from the lobby still echoed in my ears when I slipped through the glass doors leading to the balcony. The air outside was cooler, crisp, with the faint scent of autumn, and the lights of Washington, D.C. stretched across the horizon like a second constellation. I gripped the railing, forcing long breaths, trying to keep the burn in my chest from becoming tears. Inside, they had turned me into a sideshow again, the failure who had stumbled, the shadow of my father's glory. Out here, I sought silence, but silence gave me nothing but the sharp replay of every insult. Then the door creaked, and footsteps approached softly. I braced for another lecture, another smirk. Instead, a familiar voice cut through the night. "Claire." I turned, startled, and saw Rachel Carter step into the glow of the balcony lights. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, cut in a sleek style that framed her sharp, confident face. But the eyes were the same, steady, unwavering, the only pair that had ever looked at me without contempt back in those academy days. My throat tightened with relief I hadn't expected to feel. "Rachel," I whispered, the name foreign on my lips after so many years. She smiled faintly. "You still have that look ready to fight, but carrying the whole weight of the world on your shoulders." I laughed bitterly, turning back toward the skyline. "Fight what? Their words? My father's silence? There's no battle to win anymore." She came to stand beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city pulsed below us, headlights streaking like veins of fire. "Finally," Rachel said. "I remember standing in front of the disciplinary board for you. Everyone wanted you gone, but I told them you were braver than any cadet in that room." The memory hit me hard, the cold chamber of the academy, the accusing stares, the certainty that I was finished. Rachel had been the only one who stood up, the only one who swore I had value when no one else believed it. I swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in my eyes. "That was a long time ago," I said quietly. "I didn't prove them wrong. I left just like they wanted." Rachel's voice dropped lower, edged with insistence. "No, you didn't just leave. You chose another battlefield, and you saved more lives than those cadets ever will." I stiffened. "Don't," I murmured, the word sharp. "Don't say that here." She turned to me fully, her expression unwavering. "You think I don't know? I saw the reports. I know about the grid attack the night the power almost went out across half the country. I know who stopped it. My pulse spiked. The very thing I had buried, the secret that chained me to silence, was now spoken aloud in the night air. I shook my head violently. Rachel, stop. You can't talk about that. It's classified. If anyone hears. Her lips curved into a smile, but her eyes burned with conviction. Maybe it's time they did hear. I stepped closer, my voice rising, sharp with panic. Don't say a word. No one can know. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in slightly, the city lights reflecting in her gaze. Maybe it's time they finally do. Hundreds cheered for my father. Only silence waited for me. The ballroom shimmered in golden light, crystal chandeliers scattering fragments of brilliance across polished marble floors. A band played faintly near the stage, their violins weaving through the murmurs of Washington's political class and corporate elite. Uniformed officers mixed with business moguls, the air thick with perfume, cigars, and the sweet clink of champagne flutes. It was Robert Madison's night, the night to honor decades of service at the Department of Homeland Security. Every spotlight, every camera, every toast belonged to him. I sat far toward the back, the kind of seat reserved for distant relatives or guests of little consequence. I tried to disappear among the shadows of the round table, but I could feel eyes sweeping over me, whispering assessments, verdicts they had carried for years. Failure, they murmured with their glances. The same word that had dogged me since the day I walked away from the academy. Failure for leaving the uniform. Failure for chasing invisible wars in the wires of cyberspace. Failure for not being Robert Madison's true heir. The master of ceremonies raised a hand, silencing the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate the legacy of a man who has given his life to protect this nation. Please welcome to the stage Robert Madison. Thunderous applause erupted. The crowd rose as one, glasses lifted high. My father moved toward the podium, his posture still straight as a cadet's, silver hair gleaming beneath the lights. For a moment, pride stirred in me despite the ache, despite the bitterness. He was theirs tonight, untouchable, the embodiment of honor. And I was the shadow trailing behind his name. As he began his speech, I caught snippets of whispers drifting across tables near mine. There's his daughter, one man muttered to another. Never lived up to the name. A woman sighed. What a shame. All that brilliance in Robert wasted on her. The words surfaced again, carried like an echo. Failure. I clenched my fists beneath the tablecloth, nails biting into my palms. When the applause surged again, I dared to look up only to see Charles standing not far away, savoring the moment. His smile was not one of admiration for my father, but of opportunity. He leaned in toward a cluster of men in suits, his voice pitched deliberately to carry. The Madison name, he declared, should have ended with Robert. Laughter burst like glass shattering. It rolled across the tables, fed by wine and arrogance, until it reached my ears with brutal clarity. My chest tightened as heat burned its way up my neck. I wanted to rise, to scream, to tell them all that they were wrong, that they had no idea what I had done, what I had carried in silence. But my voice stayed locked in my throat. I turned to the stage, praying for some sign, some defense. My father stood at the podium, his hands gripping the sides, his gaze lowered. He did not flinch, did not rebuke, did not so much as raise his eyes toward me. His silence was a verdict. The laughter swelled again, crueler for the emptiness that followed from the one man who could have stopped it. My chair felt like a prison. My breath came shallow, each inhale heavier than the last. I forced myself to meet his eyes across the ballroom, though the distance between us stretched wider than miles. My voice cracked as I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. You won't defend me, not even now? Silence from a parent cuts deeper than 1,000 insults. The ballroom had shifted from ceremony to mingling chaos. Glasses lifted and clinked in endless toasts, the buzz of conversation humming like a hive. Waiters weaved between tables with silver trays of champagne, the golden bubbles catching the light of chandeliers that seemed almost too bright, too cruel in their brilliance. My father's speech had ended, his legacy celebrated, and now the focus returned to small clusters of gossip and laughter. I remained at my table, a spectator to my own humiliation. A group pressed me to rise again, to join in a toast. I tried to wave it off, but Charles's voice boomed over the din, leaving me no escape. Come now, Claire, he said, lifting his glass high. A toast to our family's brightest failure. Laughter roared in response, unrestrained this time. It was sharper than the polite chuckles from earlier, bolder, emboldened by champagne and my father's silence. My cheeks burned, my throat locked. I lifted the glass, but my hand shook so badly, I feared I'd spill. Each tick of the second hand on the grand clock at the back of the room felt like a hammer against my ribs. Then, slicing through the noise, Ethan's voice cracked. "If it weren't for her," he blurted, "I wouldn't be alive." The laughter collapsed into stunned quiet. All eyes snapped toward him, Charles paling, Robert frozen mid-sip, Rachel narrowing her eyes with something close to triumph. Ethan stood stiffly, his glass trembling in his hand. His words hung in the air like forbidden scripture, impossible to unsay. "Ethan," Charles snapped, his face twisting. "Enough." His hand clamped on his son's arm, shaking him back into his seat. "Drank too much," he muttered to the crowd, forcing a hollow laugh. You know how young men are, but no one laughed with him. My heart hammered, each beat echoing with a dawning horror. Ethan's slip wasn't random. His eyes darted toward me, pleading, guilty, heavy with knowledge. And in that instant, recognition seared through me. He had been there, part of the incident I had buried in secrecy. One of the lives I had saved that night in silence was standing here now, bound to me by a truth no one else knew. Rachel caught my gaze from across the room, her expression steady, fierce. She lifted her glass slightly, but her lips moved without sound. The truth won't stay buried forever. I gripped the stem of my glass until it threatened to break, a chill crawling up my spine. The mask I had worn, the one of resignation, of failure, of silence, was cracking, whether I wanted it to or not. Ethan had revealed a fracture that could not be sealed again. The guests shifted uneasily, murmurs starting like a slow tide. Charles forced another brittle laugh, but the echo of Ethan's words still throbbed through the room. My father remained motionless, his eyes fixed on nothing, as if by refusing to see, he could erase what had been spoken. And then, as the whispers threatened to swell, the ballroom doors swung open. A hush spread instantly, like a current of electricity. Standing framed in the doorway was Secretary Alan Green, the air around him charged with authority, his presence halting every conversation mid-breath. The night had changed, and I felt it in my bones. When the ballroom doors swung open, silence thundered louder than applause. The ripple of conversation died so quickly, it felt as if the air itself had been stolen away. Every head turned toward the entrance. Every glass paused halfway to lips. Even the music faltered, strings squeaking to a stop, as the musicians froze with bows suspended. Standing in the doorway was a tall man with a posture carved from steel, and a presence that filled the space before he took a single step inside. Secretary Alan Green. I had seen him before, always from a distance, a figure glimpsed on television, his calm face broadcast during crises, his words measured with the weight of the country behind them. In person, he was far more imposing. His dark suit seemed to absorb the chandelier's glow, his steady eyes cutting through the room until no one dared whisper. Guests rose to their feet almost instinctively, the rustle of fabric and the scrape of chairs echoing like a salute of its own. My pulse quickened. I felt it in my temples, in the base of my throat. I had buried my secret for so long that seeing him here felt like the world was about to rip itself open. Rachel leaned closer, her lips barely moving, but her whisper sliced clean through my panic. "It's happening." Across the room, Charles stiffened, his smile faltering for the first time all evening. He adjusted his tie, tugged his jacket, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The man who thrived on boasting suddenly looked like prey cornered under a predator's gaze. He clapped belatedly, too loudly, and the hollowness of it rang louder than the applause of 100 others. My father stood near the stage, still at the podium. His face, carved in composure, betrayed only the smallest flicker of surprise before returning to its usual mask of control. Yet I saw the way his shoulders straightened further, the way his breath hitched for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected Green either. The secretary strode into the ballroom with unhurried steps, each one resonant on the marble, each one demanding the room's full attention. He shook a few hands perfunctorily, nodded to others, but his expression never softened. Authority radiated from him, not the brittle kind built on fear, but the unyielding certainty of someone who commanded truth itself. I could hardly breathe. Every humiliation of the night, the toasts, the whispers, Charles's jeers, Ethan's slip, seemed to coalesce into this moment. The stage was no longer only my father's. Something else, something larger, was about to unfold. Green ascended the steps without introduction, without waiting for permission. The master of ceremonies stammered something, but Green silenced him with a single glance. He took the microphone, his voice measured, resonant, unshakable. "Tonight," he began, "I came here to honor a man whose service has safeguarded this nation for decades. Robert Madison's record stands as proof of dedication and sacrifice." Applause erupted, polite but subdued, under the weight of Green's presence. He let it swell, then lifted a hand. The clapping stilled instantly. His next words fell like thunder. "But I am not here to honor Robert Madison alone. I am here to honor someone else." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Guests shifted. Whispers flared. Speculation darting from table to table. I froze, my grip tightening around the back of my chair. Charles paled visibly, his hand gripping Ethan's arm as though he could steady himself with flesh and blood. Green's eyes swept the ballroom, slow, deliberate, until at last they locked on me. They did not waver. They did not blink. He was looking directly into me, as though he had carried my name, my secret, into this room with the sole purpose of laying it bare before the world. My chest rose sharply, air catching in my lungs. Around me, everything blurred: the clink of glasses, the shifting of feet, even the pulse of the orchestra beginning again somewhere in the corner. All that remained was the steady, unwavering gaze of the man who embodied judgment and justice alike. And in that gaze I knew. The silence that had branded me for years was about to end. My name rolled from his lips like thunder striking marble. For an instant, the sound seemed impossible, a hallucination conjured by desperation. But the silence that followed in the cavernous ballroom confirmed it. Everyone had heard it. Secretary Alan Green, standing beneath the weight of 100 chandeliers, had spoken my name with the authority of a verdict. The ripple it sent through the crowd was palpable. Wine glasses stilled midair. Whispers evaporated. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade beneath the weight of that single syllable. "Claire Madison," Green said, his voice steady and resonant. "Please step forward." The floor shifted under my feet as I rose. My chair scraped the marble far too loudly, a harsh reminder of the attention now seared onto me. I walked between tables where eyes tracked my every step. Some were wide with surprise, others narrow with disdain. My father's expression was unreadable, his jaw set, his knuckles white around the edge of the podium. Charles's face twitched, a strange combination of disbelief and fury, hidden poorly behind a fixed grin. Ethan sat rigid, eyes lowered. Only Rachel gave me the faintest nod, her lips curling into the suggestion of a smile, as if to say, "I told you." The stage light seared my skin when I reached the steps. Green gestured with an open palm, his presence commanding yet calm, as though this moment had been carved into history long before tonight. "Most of you are aware," he began, turning toward the audience, "that less than a year ago, this nation faced a threat more dangerous than most will ever know. A coordinated cyber attack against the U.S. power grid nearly succeeded. Had it gone unchecked, cities would have plunged into darkness. Hospitals, airports, communications paralyzed. Millions left vulnerable." Gasps stirred through the crowd, a low rumble of recognition. Rumors of the incident had leaked months ago, whispered in cautious circles but never confirmed. Green continued, his words deliberate. "We were spared from that nightmare, not by chance, nor by luck, but by one individual. An analyst who remained nameless, whose role was buried for the sake of secrecy. Someone who worked alone in the shadows, sacrificing recognition for duty." I could feel my heart pounding, each beat echoing louder than his voice. He was speaking of me, unveiling the one truth I had sworn to keep hidden. "That analyst," Green said, his eyes locking onto mine, "was Claire Madison." The room broke. Gasps, shocked murmurs, disbelieving laughter, it all crashed together in a tide of noise. For a heartbeat, I felt exposed, raw, every humiliation of the past colliding with this moment of revelation. And then the applause began, scattered at first, then swelling into thunder that shook the chandeliers. People rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, their voices merging into something overwhelming. Green opened a small velvet box, the deep blue fabric glowing under the stage lights. Inside lay a medal, gleaming with weight and history, the Medal of Valor. He lifted it with both hands, and for a moment the noise fell into reverent hush. He stepped toward me, his voice carrying over the crowd once more. "For extraordinary courage in the defense of this nation, it is my honor to present this to Claire Madison." My breath caught as the cool metal touched my chest, the ribbon draped across my shoulders. Applause surged again, louder, erupting into cheers. Somewhere in the chaos, I caught sight of Charles. His face had drained of all color, his lips trembling, his carefully curated mask cracking for the first time all night. And as the hall roared around me, as my father's silence pressed down heavier than ever, I realized this moment was not an ending. It was the spark that would burn away every lie that had suffocated me. The man who mocked me owed me more than he could ever repay. Secretary Green's voice rolled across the ballroom with the gravity of a verdict. The metal still rested heavy on my chest, its ribbon pressing into my collarbone, but the real weight was the silence of hundreds of guests waiting for what came next. Green didn't rush. He scanned the hall, letting the tension settle into every corner of the room before he spoke again. In that night of chaos, he said slowly, lives hung on the edge of collapse. And among those saved was one young man alive today because of the analyst who stood between order and devastation. He paused, then added a name that sent a visible ripple through the crowd. Ethan Walker. A gasp rolled outward like a shockwave. Heads turned, chairs creaked as people craned their necks toward Charles's son. I saw Ethan stiffen, his shoulders locking as if every eye in the room pinned him to his seat. His hands fumbled with his glass, champagne sloshing over the rim. The room buzzed with whispers, the name Walker repeated in dozens of startled voices. Charles forced a laugh, brittle and too loud. Secretary, surely this is some confusion, but Ethan's face had already betrayed him. His knuckles whitened on the stem of the glass, his lips quivering. His gaze shot to mine, desperate and pleading, then broke away as though he couldn't bear the weight of what was unsaid. Green's tone sharpened, cutting through the murmurs. You were in the sector hit hardest by the attack, were you not? Ethan swallowed hard. His father's hand clamped down on his arm, nails digging into fabric, a silent command to stay silent. For a moment I thought he would obey, that his fear of Charles outweighed the truth. But then Ethan's voice cracked out, raw and unsteady. She saved me, he blurted, words tumbling past the dam of silence. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be alive. Claire stopped it. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, exclamations, the scrape of chairs as people half rose from their seats. Camera flashes began to strobe from the back of the room, reporters surging forward like sharks scenting blood. The hum of gossip sharpened into the electric crackle of scandal, of headlines already writing themselves. Charles's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The man who had ridiculed me with such confidence now sat exposed, his carefully spun narrative unraveling thread by thread in front of the most powerful guests in Washington. Ethan had given the crowd a glimpse of the truth, and it was enough to split Charles's mask wide open. I stood frozen, heart pounding, the roar of the crowd crashing over me like surf. For years I had carried the memory of that night in silence, convinced no one would ever speak of it. Now Ethan's confession had pulled it into the open, irrevocable, undeniable. My vindication no longer belonged only to me, it had become Charles's public humiliation. The cameras flashed again, relentless, each burst illuminating his ashen face, each click of the shutters sealing his disgrace into the record. Reporters' voices overlapped in a frantic chorus, questions flying, microphones thrust forward. And through it all, Charles sat motionless, his son's words still hanging in the air, like a sentence from which there was no appeal. The spotlight had shifted, and for once, it was no longer mine to endure, it was his. For the first time, silence worked in my favor. The ballroom was trembling with applause, a wall of sound that rattled through the chandeliers and reverberated against my chest. Faces glowed with excitement, with shock, with a feverish hunger for more revelations. Yet none of that mattered. I searched through the blur of expressions until my eyes found the one I longed for, my father's. Robert Madison stood near the stage, upright and rigid as ever, but something in his stillness betrayed him. The clapping swelled and broke like waves, but around him, silence hung heavy. He was caught between duty and blood, pride and shame. His hands tightened on the edge of the podium, his lips a thin line, his eyes brighter than they should have been. I recognized that flicker hesitation, the same kind he had shown when I walked away years ago. That hesitation had gutted me once. Now it trembled on the brink of becoming something else. Charles tried to fill the space. His voice cut in, strained, desperate. This is nonsense fabricated for spectacle. My company... But the crowd drowned him out. Boos mixed with murmurs, the tide turning against him with ruthless speed. Guests no longer smiled at his jokes. The same men who had laughed at his jeers now looked at him as if he were the embarrassment. He stammered, flailed for a lifeline, but his words evaporated into the roar of voices that no longer wanted him. Ethan sat motionless, pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. Rachel stood behind the press of bodies, her expression sharp, unwavering, the quiet anchor I had not known I needed. Secretary Green held his place like a sentinel, calm and immovable, watching as the storm unfolded. I could feel the tension pulling tighter, stretching across the stage like a wire ready to snap. I could feel my father's gaze slipping between me and the crowd, between the man his reputation had demanded and the daughter he had abandoned. Then he moved. Robert stepped forward, each stride deliberate, each echo against the marble floor louder than the applause itself. He stopped before me, facing me with the full authority of his years, the air around him charged with ceremony. His right hand rose in the practiced precision of protocol, fingers firm, palm straight. A DHS salute, formal, unshakable. His voice cracked as he spoke, but the words rang clear, amplified by the microphone still waiting at the podium. "My daughter," he said, the tremor of emotion breaking through his measured tone. "My pride." The hall erupted again, applause surging into a frenzy. Yet for me, the sound blurred, the faces vanished, the lights dimmed. All that remained was the figure of the man who had stayed silent for so long, who now tried to undo years of absence with a single gesture. My chest tightened, torn between relief and resentment, longing and fury. I stepped toward the microphone, the applause still echoing, and leaned close enough that only the hall's amplification carried my words. My voice was steady, cold, a whisper sharpened into steel. "Then why did you stay silent all these years?" This was my chance not just to be seen, but to speak. The microphone felt heavier than any weapon I had ever held. Its stem was cool beneath my fingers, slick with the faint residue of others' hands, but in that instant it was mine alone. 100 faces stared up at me, faces that had sneered, mocked, whispered. Cameras ringed the edges of the room, red lights blinking like watchful eyes. The air thrummed with tension, a silence so taut I could feel it stretching across my skin. I drew in a breath, steadying the chaos inside my chest. For years I had swallowed words, biting back truths until my tongue bled with silence. Tonight, I would not. "I've been called a failure," I began, my voice raw at first, then growing. "For leaving the academy, for not following the path they demanded of me, for not fitting the shape of the legacy my father carved." My gaze swept the crowd, catching Charles's ashen face, his smirk long dissolved, and I bore it in silence because the truth was bound in shadows. I let the memory of every humiliation flicker through me, the cruel toast of my relatives, Charles's barbed jokes, my father's devastating silence. Each one was a blade, and each one I now twisted back outward. "But a failure," I said, voice rising, "doesn't spend sleepless nights tracing the claws of an attack tearing at this nation's heart. A failure doesn't gamble everything to stop the lights of this country from going dark. A failure doesn't save lives." The crowd stirred, a rustle of unease, of anticipation. The cameras angled closer, lenses narrowing in, as though to magnify every syllable. I turned my head slightly toward Charles, letting the words slice directly into him. "Lies can hide in the dark. Lies can wear a suit and smile. Lies can take credit while someone else bleeds. But lies cannot erase truth forever. And the truth is simple. I did what he claimed to do. I carried what he was too cowardly to face." The silence cracked open, a low murmur swelling into something stronger. A few hands clapped, tentative. Then others joined, building into a rhythm that thundered across the ballroom. I raised my voice above it, cutting through the roar. "A failure can't save lives, but I did." The eruption was immediate. Applause rolled over me like a wave, deafening, unstoppable. Guests rose from their chairs, some cheering, some pounding their hands against tables. Reporters shouted questions into the chaos, microphones thrust high. And at the edge of the stage, my father covered his face with one trembling hand. When he lowered it, tears streaked his cheeks. He sobbed openly, unashamed at last, his shoulders shaking as the applause shook the room. The force of it struck me with equal parts vindication and exhaustion. My body trembled, not from fear but from release. The years of silence finally shattered in the glare of lights and the roar of voices. And then, just as the applause reached its height, my eyes drifted past the crowd, past the cameras, to the shadowed back of the ballroom. There, half concealed in the darkness, stood a man I didn't recognize, an official's badge glinting faintly on his lapel. He didn't clap. He didn't move. He simply watched me, his gaze sharp, unblinking, carrying a weight that chilled the triumph in my veins. The battle, I realized, might only just be beginning. Applause roared. Yet one pair of eyes in the back frozen my victory cold. The ballroom was still alive with noise, hands striking together, the metallic clash of cutlery on glass, the thrum of voices rising in a wave that seemed it might never subside. Cameras flashed, capturing the medal on my chest, the tears on my father's face, the triumphant lift of Secretary Green's hand beside me. For a fleeting heartbeat, I allowed myself to breathe, to believe that perhaps the tide had turned for good. But then I saw him. At the far end of the room, just beyond the circle of chandeliers, stood a man who did not join in the ovation. His face was cut in stone, his body rigid, his eyes trained solely on me. They didn't hold surprise or admiration, they radiated calculation, the cold scrutiny of someone who knew too much. The applause around me blurred into meaningless thunder. It was his stare that tightened my chest, that reminded me victories are fragile things. Rachel leaned close, her whisper cutting under the noise. "That's Dalton, Mark Dalton, Deputy Director. He ran the cybersecurity unit after you were gone. He's the one who buried your name." Her words struck harder than Green's praise had lifted me. The pieces clicked together in a sickening pattern. The silence after my work, the vanishing of records, the convenient accolades handed to Charles's firm. The cover-up hadn't been negligence. It had been intent. Charles noticed him too. His posture faltered, his shoulders tightening. He pressed a handkerchief to his face, dabbing sweat from his temple, though the room was cool. For the first time that night, the mask he wore trembled at its edges. If Dalton's presence rattled him, then my suspicion was confirmed. Charles hadn't stolen credit alone. He had done it with help from inside DHS. Green raised his voice above the crowd, steady and commanding. "Tonight we celebrate not only service past, but the courage that preserves our future. Claire Madison stands as proof that vigilance comes in many forms." The ovation swelled again, but Dalton's silence pierced through it. He moved forward, unhurried, his polished shoes clicking across marble. The crowd shifted, applause faltering as heads turned. The sound of clapping thinned, replaced by murmurs. By the time Dalton reached the foot of the stage, the hall was hushed once more. He didn't need a microphone. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried with the authority of office. "With respect, Mr. Secretary, awarding her is premature. She has no clearance to disclose her alleged actions. What she claims cannot be verified publicly." A ripple ran through the audience. Some nodded faintly, unsure, others frowned, confused. The air grew heavier, the earlier triumph evaporating into unease. Cameras angled sharply toward him, hungry for conflict. My mouth went dry. All the strength I had gathered to stand here now felt suddenly fragile, a castle built on sand. The man in the shadows had stepped into the light, and his words carried the weight of legitimacy, the kind that erodes applause into suspicion. Charles seized the moment, rising from his chair. "He's right," he said, his voice trembling, but desperate to anchor itself to Dalton's authority. "Medals are for proven heroes. What she did, if she did anything at all, remains classified. We can't take her word for it." I felt the sting return, sharp as the jeers from the earlier hours of the evening. For a breath, I thought the humiliation might crash down again, undoing everything Green had handed me. But then Green stepped forward, shoulders squared, his voice cutting like a blade through the tension. "You want proof?" His gaze was ice, his tone iron. "Then let's unseal the file tonight." Gasps broke across the room. The words hit like a gavel slamming in a courtroom. Dalton's face hardened, but his eyes flickered, the briefest sign of doubt before he masked it again. The crowd erupted into whispers, reporters nearly leaping over each other in excitement. The game had changed once again. What was meant to be a celebration was turning into a tribunal, and I stood in the center of it, medal on my chest, heart hammering against my ribs. And I knew this was only the beginning. Files don't lie, but men in power do. The ballroom, moments ago drunk on champagne and spectacle, had become something else entirely. A courtroom under crystal chandeliers. Secretary Green's hand cut through the murmurs as he gestured to a technician at the side wall. The clatter of keys filled the silence, followed by the whir of a projector flickering to life. A broad white screen dropped down from the ceiling, swallowing the space above the stage. Reporters leaned forward, cameras clicking like machine fire. "Unseal the file," Green commanded. Dalton's jaw tightened. Miss Secretary, that data is classified. It was classified to bury her name, Green snapped, his voice carrying through the hall like a gavel. Tonight we end that silence. The first lines of code scrolled onto the screen. DHS system logs, time-stamped entries, security keys flashing. I recognized them immediately, the digital scars of the night I had lived in shadows, sifting through cascading errors, tracing the breach that clawed at the power grid. My breath hitched. Those strings of numbers were more than logs. They were proof of the hours I spent at the edge of collapse, alone at a console, saving lives that would never know me. Gasps rose from the crowd as Green's hand directed the technician. Highlight user ID, CM 472. The spotlight of data flared. My initials, embedded like fingerprints, the timestamp matched the precise moment the breach was stopped. This, Green said, is the analyst who ended the attack. The ballroom rustled with disbelief, with awe, with whispers like sparks in a storm. I felt their eyes on me, not mocking now, but searching, measuring. Dalton stepped forward, voice low but sharp. Simulation data. Mock exercises often mirror real threats. Without context, this proves nothing. The crowd wavered, uncertainty gnawing at the edges of the revelation. He was good calm, authoritative, the kind of denial that carried weight. For a breath, I feared he would win back the room. Then Rachel moved. She emerged from the throng of guests, her heels striking marble with precision. In her hand was a sleek drive, silver glinting under the lights. She spoke clearly, her voice steady, as though she had rehearsed this moment for years. That's a lie. I made a backup the night they erased her name. If Dalton calls this a simulation, let's compare it against the original. Gasps rippled again, sharper this time. Rachel handed the drive to Green, who nodded and passed it to the technician. Fingers flew over the keys, windows overlapping across the projection screen. Two sets of data aligned side by side. The crowd held its breath. Line by line, the logs matched every key, every entry identical. Except one addition. A cross-reference tab Green had ordered revealed GPS location markers from users active during the breach. The technician highlighted the entry. Two names glowed in the harsh light, Claire Madison and Ethan Walker. The hall fell utterly still. My heart pounded in the cavern of silence. There it was, the undeniable link. Not only had I stopped the attack, but Ethan's presence was logged in the threatened zone. His survival was the living proof of what I had done. Ethan's face blanched, his lips parting, eyes shimmering with tears he refused to let fall. The audience turned toward him, then back to Charles, then to Dalton. The chain of betrayal stretched clear as daylight. I had saved a life they had tried to erase, and the man who mocked me owed me everything. Chaos ignited. Voices shouted across the ballroom, outrage boiling over. "Investigate Dalton!" someone barked. "What else did they cover up?" another cried. Charles's name hissed on every tongue, his reputation unraveling in real time under the glare of media lenses. The air itself vibrated with fury and revelation. For the first time, their outrage was not aimed at me, but at the men who had stolen my name, my sacrifice, my life's work. And I knew this was no longer just my vindication. It was their public disgrace. The louder he shouted, the more the room smelled his fear. Charles's voice cracked through the storm of outrage, desperate and ragged. "This is fabricated! Do you hear me? Fabricated!" He slammed his palm against the edge of the table, glasses trembling, champagne spilling onto white linen. The projection screen still glowed behind him, line after line of unsealed DHS logs, painting his betrayal in fluorescent clarity. But Charles kept shouting, voice hoarse, sweat gleaming at his temples. "It's doctored data. My company has served with integrity for decades. This is a smear campaign orchestrated by—" His words faltered, his hands cutting wild through the air, as if he could grab hold of something to steady himself. The crowd was unmoved. Eyes narrowed, lips curled in disdain. The guests leaned away from him as though his panic were contagious. The scent of fear truly seemed to rise from him, acrid and sour, a stench, invisible but unmistakable. Cameras clicked in furious rhythm, reporters pushing forward to catch every detail, every twist of his face. Ethan's voice sliced through the din. It was sharp, anguished, and louder than his father's denial. "Stop lying!" he cried. His body shook, his face pale, but his words struck like hammer blows. He stepped into the open space, eyes blazing not with shame, but with rage. You knew all along. She saved me. You let them erase her anyway, gasps erupted. The weight of his confession landed squarely on Charles, pinning him in place. The cameras pivoted instantly, capturing Ethan's trembling frame, his voice cracking with truth. His eyes darted toward me, then back to his father, fury and sorrow intermingled. You told me to stay quiet. You told me it was for the good of the company. But it wasn't for the company, was it? It was for you. Charles staggered back, his mouth open, but no words came. He lifted a finger as though to scold his son, but the gesture withered into the air. Every guest in that hall could see the collapse in him now the bluster evaporated, leaving only a man cornered by the truth he had spent years avoiding. Secretary Green advanced, calm but merciless, his voice cut with surgical precision. Let's not pretend this was ignorance. Charles Walker's firm received millions in government contracts based on his supposed success in preventing that very cyber attack. Contracts awarded on false credit, stolen valor. He turned Claire Madison's sacrifice into his profit margin. The hall exploded into shouts. Shame! Fraud! The words rose, harsh and unrelenting. Reporters barked questions, flashes strobing across Charles's twisted face. He swayed where he stood, then collapsed into a chair, his body folding under the weight of humiliation. His once proud shoulders slumped, his chin falling to his chest. Boos roared, rattling the chandeliers, a tidal wave of public disgrace that no amount of wealth or excuses could smother. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in a strange rhythm between triumph and grief. This was the man who had mocked me, who had stolen my name, who had built an empire on my silence. And now he was reduced to this, a broken figure drenched in sweat, crushed beneath the gaze of the world. Then the reporters turned. They surged forward, cameras raised, microphones thrust toward me. Their voices overlapped in a frenzy, but one cut clearer than the rest. Claire, what do you want to say to the man who betrayed you? The lights burned hotter, the hall swirled with noise, and every eye waited for my answer. For years, his silence wounded me tonight. His words healed. The ballroom had shifted into something quieter, almost reverent. The chaos of Charles's collapse still lingered at the edges, the whispers, the flurry of reporters, the echoes of boos, but now the spotlight drifted back to the stage where my father stood. His hands trembled around the microphone as he adjusted it, the sound of static crackling in the hush. He looked older than he had only hours ago, lines etched deeper into his face, his shoulders bowed not from age, but from years of holding a silence too heavy. His eyes found me across the space, and I saw them glisten. For a long moment, he said nothing. The same stillness that had once gutted me in that academy office, at the banquet, in the living room where relatives laughed. I braced for it again, for silence to wound me once more. But then his voice broke through, thin and raw, carrying the weight of a confession years overdue. I failed my daughter, Robert Madison said, the words reverberating against crystal and marble. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by an aching stillness. Not because she failed me, but because when she needed me most, I held my tongue. I told myself it was dignity. I told myself it was discipline, but in truth, it was cowardice. The admission cracked something inside me. My chest ached with the sudden rush of emotions I had starved of expression. I gripped the edge of the podium, grounding myself against the force of hearing aloud what I had only ever whispered to myself in the dark. Robert's hand shook as he pointed toward me. I let her carry the weight of mockery, of shame, while I stood by. I should have stood for her. Tonight I will not make that mistake again. His voice steadied as he drew a breath, shoulders squaring, his spine reclaiming the steel of the officer he once was. She is the true legacy of the Madison name, he declared, his tone rising with certainty. Not me, not the medals on my wall, not the career they applaud. It is her, my daughter, who embodies what service and sacrifice mean. The crowd erupted, rising to their feet as one. The ovation thundered, not for him this time, but for us, for the truth laid bare, for the bridge built where a chasm had split for years. I could feel the energy coursing through the hall, hear the cheers ripple like a tide, but all I could see was my father, his face streaked with tears, his lips trembling, as though he had been waiting decades to finally speak. He turned toward me, and with emotion both formal and profoundly personal, he raised his hand in salute once more. But this time there was no hesitation, no mask. His arm quivered under the force of tears, his voice breaking as he said, "My daughter, my pride. The ovation swelled higher, but my heart heard only the crack in his words, the healing stitched into every syllable. I stepped closer, the microphone trembling in my hand, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then stand with me," I said, my throat tight, my eyes locked on his, not behind me. Justice doesn't vanish, it waits for the right stage. The ballroom was hushed again, but this time the silence was not cruel. It was reverent, electric, alive with the aftershocks of truth finally spoken. Outside the tall windows, the skyline of Washington, D.C. gleamed, monuments glowing against the midnight sky, the city's heartbeat steady and eternal. Inside, the chaos had settled into something heavier: resolution. Secretary Green stepped back to the microphone. His voice carried the authority of his office, but also the satisfaction of a man who had just pried corruption into the light. Tonight we witnessed not only the celebration of one career, but the revelation of another. Claire Madison's work saved this nation from a disaster most can barely imagine. The Department of Homeland Security will not let such courage be buried again. From this moment forward, we will partner directly with Madison in developing the next generation of our cybersecurity defenses. The declaration rippled through the room. Applause rose once more, but now it was measured, respectful, stripped of the hollow politeness that had once mocked me. It was applause that meant belief. I breathed it in, letting the sound settle deep where silence had once cut me open. Rachel was the first to reach me. She wrapped me in an embrace that was firm, unshaken, as though she had been holding that place at my side for years, waiting for this moment. "I told you," she whispered, her voice warm against the roar of the room. "The truth can't stay buried forever." When she pulled back, Ethan stood waiting. His face was pale, streaked with shame, but his eyes were steady. He hesitated, then bowed his head. "I'm sorry, Claire, for staying quiet, for letting them erase you. I owe you my life, and I never said it." His words cracked, raw and bare. I met his gaze, searching for deceit, but found only sincerity, the kind that trembled with the weight of guilt. Slowly, I nodded. "Then say it now," I said softly, "and live like you mean it." He swallowed hard, then whispered, "Thank you." My father stepped forward then, shoulders no longer hunched beneath the burden of silence. His hand settled gently on my arm, his eyes still damp, but no longer clouded. "From this night on," Robert said, his voice unsteady but certain, "I will walk beside you. Not behind, not apart, beside." The weight in my chest eased, the fracture lines of years of pain knitting, if not healed, at least joined. I felt the crowd lean in, expectant, waiting. For once, I didn't shy away from their gaze. I turned to face them fully, the metal gleaming against my chest, the microphone warm in my hand. "They called me a failure," I said, my voice clear, ringing against crystal and marble. "But failure doesn't save a nation." My breath caught, but I pushed the words forward, letting them strike with the force of truth. I did. The hall erupted. The ovation shook the chandeliers, rattled the glass in the windows. Reporters surged, flashes blinded, but I stood unmoving, letting the sound wash through me. I was no longer shrinking, no longer silent. I was standing where I had always belonged. When at last the night ebbed, when the last speeches faded and the guests began to trickle into the cool air of the Capitol, I slipped toward the doors. The marble floor stretched ahead, the weight of the evening pressing heavy and light all at once. Rachel's smile, Ethan's apology, my father's promise, they lingered in me as I stepped outside. There, beneath the glow of the city lights, a dark sedan waited at the curb. A man in a crisp suit stepped forward, his badge gleaming faintly under the lamplight. His words were calm, but they carried the gravity of a summons I had thought I'd never hear. "Director Madison," he said, voice firm, "the country needs you again." Justice had been delayed, buried beneath years of silence and stolen credit, but in the end, it stood taller than every lie. The betrayal that once cut deepest became the very stage where truth thundered loud enough for all to hear, leaving the guilty exposed and the broken restored. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime, reminding us that power may deceive, but proof endures. Like cracks in marble, no wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If this story stirred you, please like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you felt the same fire of justice, or 2 if you think the reckoning should have gone further.